When my son pulled up to my $7 million mansion that winter evening, he hesitated at the gates like a stranger who wasn't sure he belonged, and for a brief moment, I almost didn't recognize him either. The same boy I had once held through sleepless nights now stood outside my life as if I had never been part of his at all, and the irony settled quietly in my chest, cold and steady, because just 2 weeks earlier, on Christmas Eve, he had looked me straight in the eye across a table glowing with candlelight and said words that should have shattered me but somehow didn't. I remember the way the tree lights flickered behind him, soft gold reflecting in ornaments I had collected over decades, each one holding a memory I once believed we shared, and yet his voice cut through all of it with a calmness that felt rehearsed, like a line he had practiced more than once. "Mom, I think it's best if we take some space," he said, not angry, not even emotional, just distant, and beside him, Ashley sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable except for the faintest hint of satisfaction that flickered and disappeared before anyone else could notice. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him to explain what space really meant, because deep down, I already understood that this wasn't about space at all, it was about separation. About erasing me from a life I had spent nearly 4 decades building for him, and the room felt smaller. Somehow, even though it was the same dining room where I had hosted every Christmas since he was 5 years old, the same table where he used to leave crumbs from sugar cookies and laugh when I pretended to scold him, and now there he was, sitting in the same chair, speaking to me like I was a distant relative he barely tolerated. I nodded once, slowly, as if he had just told me something ordinary, something that didn't carry the weight of finality, and I reached for my glass of water, my hand steady despite the silence that followed, because silence has a way of revealing more truth than words ever could, and in that moment, I realized something that surprised even me. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was simply aware that whatever connection we once had had already been slipping away long before this night, piece by piece, unnoticed or perhaps deliberately ignored. I stood up before the dessert was served, before anyone could offer a polite excuse or an awkward apology, and I picked up my coat from the back of the chair, smoothing the fabric as if it were any other evening. As if I were simply heading home after a pleasant dinner, and Daniel didn't stop me, he didn't even stand, he just watched, his expression neutral, almost relieved, while Ashley offered a small, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I walked out of that house without looking back, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I had nothing left to look at. The cold air outside was sharp against my skin, the kind of winter chill that makes everything feel clearer, more defined, and as I drove home, the streets lined with glowing decorations and families gathered behind warm windows, I felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over me, not emptiness, not even sadness, just stillness, as if something inside me had quietly shifted into place, and when I reached my own house, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I just stood there in the dark entryway, listening to the silence, letting it wrap around me until it no longer felt heavy but instead, strangely, felt like space, real space. The kind that isn't forced on you but given, the kind that allows you to see things as they are without distraction, and that was the night I understood that being cut off wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of something else entirely, something they hadn't anticipated. Something they would only begin to understand when they stood where my son was standing now, outside my gates, wondering how everything had changed without them noticing at all. I did not sleep that night, not because I was heartbroken in the way people expect, but because my mind had grown too quiet, and in that silence, things began to arrange themselves with an uncomfortable clarity that I had been avoiding for years. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on my nightstand, and for the first time, I allowed myself to replay not just what Daniel had said, but everything that had led up to that moment, every small dismissal, every polite excuse, every time I had convinced myself that I was overthinking when in reality I had simply been unwilling to see the truth. The distance had not appeared overnight, it had been carefully built, layer by layer, until it became something solid enough to stand between us. I remembered the Thanksgiving before, when I had asked what time dinner would be and Daniel told me they were keeping it small that year, just the two of them, his voice casual, almost apologetic, and I had smiled into the phone and said I understood, even though I had already prepared half the meal in my own kitchen, telling myself it was just a change in plans. But later that evening, I saw the photos online, a full table, friends and family gathered, laughter captured in perfect frames, and I was not in a single one of them, I remembered. The way Ashley would gently correct him when he spoke to me, the subtle shifts in tone, the way she would answer questions directed at him as if she had quietly taken control of the conversation, and Daniel would let her, not because he agreed, I think, but because it was easier, because challenging her meant disrupting the version of peace he had chosen for himself. There were smaller things too. Details that once seemed insignificant but now felt like pieces of a pattern I could no longer ignore. The time I showed up with gifts for their anniversary and Ashley laughed lightly, saying they had decided not to exchange anything that year, the way Daniel avoided my eyes as he thanked me, or the afternoon I suggested we have lunch together, and he hesitated just a second too long before explaining how busy things had been lately, always temporary. Until temporary became permanent without either of us acknowledging it. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, but the memories did not stop, they simply shifted, moving further back to a time when things were simpler, when Daniel would call just to tell me about his day, when my presence in his life was not something that needed to be negotiated or scheduled, and I wondered when exactly that had changed, when I had become someone he needed distance from instead of someone he turned toward. But the question did not come with anger, only with a quiet acceptance that some changes happen so gradually that by the time you notice them, they are already complete. Sometime before dawn, I got out of bed and walked into the kitchen. The hardwood floors cooled beneath my feet, and I made myself a cup of coffee, the familiar routine grounding me in a way nothing else could. I stood by the window as the sky began to lighten, watching the neighborhood come to life, and for a moment, everything looked exactly the same as it always had, and yet I knew it was not, because something inside me had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I was no longer waiting for an explanation or an apology. I was no longer trying to fit myself back into a place where I had quietly been removed. Instead, I found myself asking a different question entirely, not why they had done this, but what I was going to do next, and the answer did not come all at once, it rarely does, but it began as a small, steady thought that settled into my mind with surprising certainty. I had spent years adjusting my life around theirs, making space, giving understanding, offering patience, and now, for the first time in a long while, I realized that I did not have to do that anymore. The space they had asked for had already been created, and what I chose to do with it was entirely my own decision. And as I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling its warmth settle in my chest, I understood that this was not the kind of ending that left you empty. It was the kind that quietly handed you back something you did not realize you had lost, and I intended to use it. Later that morning, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I sat down at my desk without a specific purpose tied to someone else's needs, no list for holiday meals, no reminders to call Daniel, no small adjustments to fit myself into a life that no longer had room for me, and for a few moments, I simply stared at the surface in front of me, the polished wood reflecting faint traces of sunlight, and I realized how unfamiliar that feeling was, the absence of obligation, the absence of waiting. It felt almost uncomfortable at first, like wearing a new pair of shoes that had not yet softened with time, but I stayed there anyway, letting the quiet stretch without rushing to fill it. Eventually, my gaze drifted to a drawer I had not opened in years, one that held documents I had carefully tucked away during a different chapter of my life, a chapter one rarely spoke about because it never seemed necessary, not when my focus had always been on providing, on building something stable for Daniel, something he could rely on without ever needing to know how it came together. And yet now, as I pulled the drawer open and sorted through neatly organized folders, I felt a subtle shift in perspective, as if I was looking at my own life from a distance and finally seeing it in full. There were investment statements, property records, handwritten notes from meetings long past, evidence of decisions made quietly and consistently over decades, decisions that had never required recognition or approval, only patience. And I remembered the years after my husband passed, how I had learned to manage everything on my own. How I had sat across from advisors who spoke in numbers and projections while I listened carefully, asked questions, and made choices that felt right even when they were not easy, and how, piece by piece, I had created something that existed entirely separate from the role I played as a mother. I ran my fingers along the edge of one particular document before pulling it free, the weight of it familiar in a way that grounded me, and for a moment, I allowed myself to consider how differently things might have unfolded if Daniel had known about any of this. If he had understood that the version of me he had gradually dismissed was never the full picture, but the thought passed quickly, because it no longer mattered what he knew or did not know. What mattered was what I chose to do now. I closed the folder gently and leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly as the pieces continued to fall into place, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a steady, deliberate manner that felt far more powerful, like a quiet current moving beneath the surface. And I found myself thinking about Christmas again, not the one that had already passed, but the one that was still ahead, the one that everyone else would assume had already been decided without me, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, not out of spite or resentment, but out of clarity, because for the first time, I could see the situation for what it truly was, not a rejection that defined me, but an opportunity that freed me from expectations I had been carrying for far too long. I stood up and walked toward the window, the morning light now fully settled across the neighborhood, illuminating everything with a sharpness that felt symbolic in a way I could not ignore. And I realized that the next steps did not require urgency or explanation, they required intention, the kind that is built quietly, without announcement, without the need for validation. And as I turned back toward my desk, I reached for my phone, not to call Daniel, not to seek understanding or closure, but to begin setting something in motion, something that would unfold in its own time, on my terms, and for once, that felt exactly right. The call I made that morning was brief, almost unremarkable to anyone who might have overheard it, and yet it carried a weight that even I had not fully anticipated, because it was not just a call to arrange logistics or confirm details. It was a quiet step toward reclaiming something that had always been mine but had somehow faded into the background of my own life. I spoke calmly, clearly, giving instructions without hesitation, and on the other end, the response was immediate, respectful, and efficient in a way that reminded me how different certain relationships felt when they were built on mutual understanding rather than obligation. And when I ended the call, I did not feel anxious or uncertain. I felt settled, as if a decision that had been forming beneath the surface had finally found its shape. Over the next few days, I moved through my routine with a steadiness that might have seemed ordinary from the outside, but internally, everything felt sharper, more intentional. I noticed details I had once overlooked, the way the light shifted across the rooms in the afternoon, the quiet hum of appliances that had always blended into the background, the subtle rhythm of a life that no longer revolved around waiting for someone else's schedule. And with each passing day, the absence of Daniel's presence felt less like a void and more like a clearing, an open space that allowed something new to take form without interference. I did not reach out to him, not because I was trying to prove a point, but because I no longer felt the need to fill the silence he had created, and that realization surprised me more than anything else, because for years, I had been the one to bridge the distance, to call first, to suggest plans, to smooth over the gaps with patience and understanding, and now, for the first time, I simply let the silence exist, and in doing so, I began to see it differently, not as something heavy or uncomfortable, but as something honest. One afternoon, as I reviewed a series of confirmations and updates, I paused when I saw a familiar address appear on the screen, an address that held no emotional weight for me anymore, only context, only history, and I considered, briefly, what Daniel might think when he received what I was preparing to send, whether he would recognize it for what it truly was or whether he would interpret it through the same narrow lens that had shaped his recent decisions. But the thought did not linger, because his interpretation was no longer something I could control, nor was it something I needed to anticipate. Instead, I focused on the clarity of my own intentions, on the quiet certainty that had replaced the confusion of that Christmas night. And I realized that this was not about proving anything to him or to anyone else. It was about aligning my actions with a truth I had finally allowed myself to acknowledge, that I was not someone to be set aside or diminished simply because it made life more convenient for others. Later that evening, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the sleeve of my sweater, and for a moment, I studied my reflection with a level of attention I had not given it in years, not searching for flaws or signs of age, but simply observing, taking in the person who had carried so much without complaint, who had adapted, adjusted, and endured without ever asking for recognition, and I felt a quiet sense of respect settle within me, not pride, not even satisfaction, just recognition, as if I was finally seeing myself with the same clarity I had always reserved for others. I turned away from the mirror and walked into the living room, where the early evening light cast long shadows across the floor, and I allowed myself a small pause, a moment to stand still and absorb the quiet confidence that had taken root in the days since everything had changed. And it occurred to me then that what I was building was not a reaction, it was a response, deliberate, measured, and entirely my own, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it meant that whatever came next would not be shaped by hurt or resentment, but by something far more enduring, something that did not need to be loud or dramatic to be powerful, it simply needed to be true. The confirmations began arriving quietly over the next few days, each one precise, each one reinforcing the decision I had already made, and I found a certain calm in reviewing them, not because they represented something extravagant or excessive, but because they reflected a level of control and clarity that had been absent from my life for far too long. I moved through each detail with care, not rushing, not second-guessing, simply allowing the process to unfold the way it was meant to, and, with every step, I felt more aligned with a version of myself I had not fully acknowledged in years, the version that had once made difficult decisions without hesitation, the version that had understood the value of patience and timing without needing validation from anyone else. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk going through another set of documents, I paused when I came across an old photograph tucked between two folders. It was small, slightly worn at the edges, and it showed Daniel at around 8 years old, standing in the backyard with a wide, unguarded smile, holding up a small wooden project we had worked on together. I remembered that day clearly, the way he had insisted on doing most of the work himself, the way he had looked to me for approval even when he pretended he did not need it, and for a moment, I allowed that memory to settle, not as something painful, but as something complete, something that belonged to a different time, and I realized that holding on to that version of him was what had kept me anchored in a place that no longer existed. I set the photograph aside carefully and returned my attention to the present, because the present required clarity, not nostalgia, and the more I focused on what I was building now, the more I understood that this was not about rewriting the past or correcting it. It was about recognizing where I stood and choosing not to diminish that position for the sake of maintaining a connection that had already changed. Later that evening, I received a brief message from Daniel, the first since Christmas. It was short, almost hesitant, asking if everything was all right, the kind of question that felt more like an obligation than a genuine concern, and I read it once, then again, noticing the careful distance in his wording, the absence of warmth, and for a moment, I considered how I might have responded before, how I would have filled the space with reassurance, with an invitation to talk, with an attempt to restore something that no longer existed in the same form. But this time, I did not feel that impulse. Instead, I placed the phone down without replying, not out of anger, but out of understanding, because his message was not an opening, it was a gesture, and I no longer needed to interpret gestures as opportunities. The room was quiet around me, the soft hum of the evening settling in, and I stood up, walking slowly through the house, taking in the familiar spaces with a renewed sense of awareness, each room reflecting years of effort, of decisions made with intention, and I realized how much of my identity had been tied to what I gave rather than what I had created for myself, and that realization did not bring regret, it brought perspective, because it allowed me to see the difference between what had been shared and what had always been mine. I stopped by the window, looking out at the fading light, and I thought about the invitations that would soon be received, about the quiet shift that would take place when those envelopes were opened, and I felt no urgency to explain. No need to prepare for reactions or questions, because whatever came next would not require defense or justification. It would simply exist as the natural result of choices made with clarity and purpose. And as I turned away from the window, I felt a steady sense of readiness settle within me, not anticipation in the usual sense, but something deeper, something grounded, because for the first time in a long time, I was not reacting to circumstances, I was shaping them. And that distinction changed everything. The envelopes were sent out on a quiet Tuesday morning, each one identical in appearance, understated, almost ordinary at first glance, and I made sure of that intentionally, because there's a certain kind of power in subtlety, a kind that does not announce itself but instead waits patiently to be discovered, and as I stood at the post office counter handing them over, I felt no hesitation, no second thoughts. Only a steady sense of alignment with the decision I had already made. The clerk did not look at me twice, did not question the number or the destination, and in that moment, it struck me how easily something significant can begin without drawing any attention at all. Over the next few days, I returned to my routine with the same quiet focus that had guided me from the start. I went through my mornings without checking my phone for messages, without wondering if Daniel would reach out again. Because whatever he chose to do no longer dictated the rhythm of my life, and that realization settled into me with a calm certainty that felt both new and familiar at the same time. By the end of the week, the responses began to arrive, not directly to me at first, but in small, indirect ways that revealed themselves gradually. A missed call from a distant relative I had not spoken to in months, a brief message from an old family friend asking if everything was all right, each one carrying a tone of curiosity that had not been there before, and I understood immediately what it meant. The invitations had been received, opened, and read, and with them, the quiet shift I had anticipated was already beginning to take place. It was not long before Daniel's name appeared on my phone again, this time with more urgency than before, the call coming through twice in quick succession before I allowed it to ring out, not as a form of punishment, but because I wanted to observe, to understand the pattern without interrupting it, and when the message finally came through, it was different from the first, less distant, more direct, asking where I was, asking what was going on, and for a moment, I held the phone in my hand considering the weight of those questions, not because I felt compelled to answer them, but because I recognized the shift they represented, the beginning of awareness on his part that something had changed in a way he did not control. I placed the phone back down and continued with what I was doing, moving through the house with a quiet sense of purpose, checking the details that had already been set in motion, confirming what needed to be confirmed, adjusting nothing that did not require it, because everything had been planned with care from the beginning. And as I moved from one room to another, I found myself reflecting not on the reactions I might receive, but on the clarity that had brought me here, the understanding that this was not about reclaiming attention or proving a point. It was about stepping fully into a position I had always held but had not always recognized. That evening, as the sun lowered and the light shifted once again across the familiar walls, I stood by the window and allowed myself a moment to pause. Not in anticipation, but in quiet acknowledgement of how far I had come from that Christmas night, the distance between those 2 points not measured in time alone, but in perspective, in the way I now saw both myself and the people around me with a level of clarity that left no room for doubt, and I understood then that whatever unfolded next would not change that clarity. It would simply reveal it to others, in its own time, in its own way, and for once, that was enough. The morning of the gathering arrived without any sense of urgency, which in itself felt like a quiet statement, because there was a time when hosting something like this would have filled me with a kind of nervous energy, a need to ensure every detail was perfect for everyone else. But this was different. This was not about meeting expectations or creating comfort for others, it was about presence. About allowing everything to unfold exactly as it had been planned without second-guessing the intention behind it. And as I moved through the house, I noticed how naturally everything had come together, the arrangements placed with care but not excess, the lighting soft and intentional, the space itself speaking in a way that did not require explanation. I paused for a moment near the entrance, my hand resting lightly against the polished surface of the table beside me, and I let the stillness settle. Not because I was waiting for anything, but because I understood that what was about to happen was not a performance, it was a reveal, not loud or dramatic, but undeniable in its presence, and I felt no need to rehearse words or anticipate reactions, because whatever needed to be understood would become clear on its own. The first car arrived just as the afternoon light began to shift, its movement slow as it approached the gate, the hesitation visible even from a distance. And I watched without stepping forward, without signaling, simply observing as the barrier opened and allowed them through, one by one, each arrival carrying its own quiet uncertainty, and I could almost sense the questions forming before they even stepped out, the subtle tension that comes when expectations do not align with reality. When the doorbell rang, I waited a moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, and when I opened the door, I was met with expressions that ranged from polite curiosity to something closer to disbelief, and I greeted them the same way I would have greeted anyone, with calm, with composure, without offering explanations that had not been asked for. Daniel arrived shortly after, his car pulling in with a kind of urgency that stood in contrast to the others, and when he stepped out, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where he simply stood there, looking at the house as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew, and I watched him from the doorway. Not moving toward him, not calling out, allowing him to approach in his own time, and when our eyes finally met, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not confusion exactly, but awareness, the kind that begins to settle when assumptions no longer hold. He walked up the steps more slowly than I expected, Ashley just behind him, her composure intact but her gaze sharper, more calculating, taking in every detail as if searching for something she could define, something she could categorize, and I stepped aside to let them in, offering the same quiet greeting I had given the others, no more, no less, because this moment did not require emphasis, it required clarity. Inside, the room carried a hum of restrained conversation, voices lowered, movements measured, as if everyone was aware, on some level, that they were stepping into something they did not fully understand, and I moved through the space without drawing attention, acknowledging each person with the same steady presence, allowing them to take in their surroundings without interruption, and as I did, I felt a sense of alignment settle deeper within me, not because of their reactions, but because of my own, because I was no longer adjusting, no longer accommodating, I was simply existing in a space that reflected who I was without compromise, and that, more than anything else, changed the way everything else would unfold. The shift in the room became more noticeable as the minutes passed, not through anything loud or obvious, but through the way conversations faltered and restarted, the way glances lingered just a second longer than usual, and I could feel it without needing to look directly, that quiet recalibration happening in each of them as they tried to understand where they stood in relation to me now, not where they had assumed I was, but where I actually was, and that difference carried a weight none of them had prepared for. I moved toward the center of the room with an ease that came not from habit, but from certainty, and when I finally spoke, it was not to command attention, but to acknowledge what was already present, the unspoken questions, the subtle tension, the awareness that something fundamental had shifted, and I kept my voice steady, measured, allowing each word to settle without urgency, because this was not a moment that required explanation, it required recognition. I thanked them for coming, simply, without embellishment, and I could see how that alone unsettled the balance, because it offered no immediate clarity, no direct answers, only an invitation to observe, and I let a brief pause follow, not as a technique, but as a natural extension of the space I had created, and in that pause, I saw Daniel's posture change slightly, his shoulders tightening, his attention fully fixed on me now in a way it had not been for a long time, as if he was beginning to understand that whatever was happening here was not something he could redirect or define. I continued by speaking about time, about how easily it passes without us noticing the shifts that happen within it, how roles can quietly change when we are not paying attention, and how assumptions can take the place of understanding if we allow them to, and I did not raise my voice or emphasize any particular point, I simply stated what was true, allowing the meaning to form on its own, and I could feel the room responding, not with words, but with stillness, the kind that signals awareness rather than confusion. When I turned slightly toward Daniel, it was not with accusation or expectation, but with clarity. And I held his gaze long enough for him to recognize that this was not the same dynamic he had grown used to, that the space between us was no longer something he could navigate with distance alone. And I spoke to him directly, not about what he had said on Christmas, not about the words that had created this separation, but about what those words had revealed, about the position he believed I held in his life, and how that understanding had allowed me to see something I had overlooked before, and I could see the realization beginning to take shape in his expression, not fully formed, but present, the first indication that the assumptions he carried were being challenged by something he could not easily dismiss. Ashley remained composed, her attention sharp. But even she could not fully conceal the shift, the way her posture adjusted, the way her gaze moved more carefully now, as if reassessing the situation in real time, and I acknowledged her presence with the same calm I had shown everyone else, because this was not about isolating one person or assigning blame. It was about redefining the entire structure that had allowed certain patterns to exist. I took a step back then, not retreating, but allowing the space to expand once more. And I let the room absorb what had been said without rushing to fill it with further explanation, because the clarity I carried did not need reinforcement, it needed time to settle, and as I looked around at the faces gathered there, I understood that this moment was not about confrontation, it was about alignment, about bringing everything into a state where it could no longer be misunderstood, and in that stillness, I felt no need to add anything more. Because everything that mattered had already been placed exactly where it needed to be. I let the silence remain just a moment longer, long enough for everyone in the room to feel it, not as discomfort, but as something settling into place, something that could no longer be ignored or softened by polite conversation, and when I finally spoke again, my voice did not rise or harden, it simply carried with it a clarity that did not require emphasis, because what I was about to say was not new. It had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. I told them that life has a way of revealing truth not through conflict, but through distance, through the quiet spaces where intentions become visible without explanation, and I explained calmly that what happened on Christmas had not taken anything from me, it had simply shown me where I truly stood, not where I believed I stood, but where I was actually placed, and that understanding had changed everything. I turned to Daniel then, not as someone seeking an apology, not as someone waiting to be reassured, but as someone who had already moved beyond that need, and I told him that the space he had asked for had given me something I did not realize I was missing. It had given me perspective, and with that perspective came a kind of freedom that I had not felt in years, because I was no longer trying to hold together something that had already shifted beyond recognition. I could see it in his face, the way his expression softened into something uncertain, something searching, as if he was trying to find the version of me he was used to, the one who would fill the silence, who would explain, who would make it easier for him to step back into a role that required less reflection. But that version of me was no longer standing in front of him, and I did not rush to replace it. Instead, I continued, explaining that everything he saw around him, this home, this gathering, this moment, was not a reaction, it was a continuation of a life I had built quietly, steadily, without needing acknowledgement, and that nothing that had been said or done could diminish that, because it had never depended on anyone else's approval to exist. I made it clear, gently but firmly, that I was not here to revisit the past or assign blame. I was here to define the present, to establish what would and would not continue moving forward, and I said that relationships, like anything of value, require mutual recognition, not assumption, not convenience, but recognition, and that without it, distance is not only inevitable, it is necessary. Ashley shifted slightly beside him, her composure still intact, but her certainty less visible now. And I acknowledged her with the same steady calm, not as an opponent, not as someone to confront, but as part of a dynamic that had existed long before this moment, a dynamic that I was no longer willing to participate in without clarity. I stepped back then, allowing the weight of what I had said to settle naturally, without pushing it further, because I understood that understanding does not come from repetition, it comes from stillness, from the space where words are no longer needed, and as I looked at Daniel one last time, I spoke a single sentence, not as a conclusion, but as a truth that required no elaboration. I told him that he had not removed me from his life, he had revealed where I belonged. And that was something I would no longer question or try to change. The room remained quiet. After that, not tense, not fractured, just quiet, as if everything that needed to shift had already begun, and I felt no urgency to guide what came next, because for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting for anything. I was simply standing in a place that was fully my own, and that was enough.